All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webcast. Today's topic is the different types of policies and how they interact with CA Privileged Identity Manager. My name is Kristen Malzone. I am the lead community manager for the CA security community. And today we have Peter Eiferung presenting from CA Services. So I'm going to pass the ball over to Peter in just a minute. And he will walk through today's presentation. While he's presenting, feel free to ask a question in the chat window or the Q&A window found in the WebEx window that you're currently looking at. Or you can wait until the end of the call where we'll have live Q&A and we'll be able to then unmute your line if you want to ask a question over the phone. So I'm going to pass it over to Peter now. Thank you, Peter, for doing this today. We're really excited to hear about this topic. It seems to be a really hot topic that a lot of people want to learn more about. So thank you.
No problem. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, team, or individuals on the phone. My name is Peter Eiferung. I am a CA Services architect. I've been with CA since 1999. And I've dealt with the solution since 1996, so as far as background is concerned. So without much ado, let's continue. So for the agenda for today, I always believe that we should always cover the basics of fine-grained access control policies. So part of this presentation is going to deal regarding the basics. After that, we're going to start talking about policy naming standards, what you should do with regards to how you should define that, and then we're going to go through some basic guidelines of, policies themselves, and then, of course, the process of policy implementation, right? We're going to go through a little bit of that. We're also going to talk a little bit about the sample policies that come out of the box with the solution. And in addition to that, the policy deployment considerations. Essentially, I would consider these best practices with regards to what you should do with regards to deploying a policy when you start creating the policy, what should be in your mind when you actually start developing it. Okay, so the basics of fine-grained access control policies. The first thing that we should all know with regards to with Privileged Identity Manager is a policy is essentially a set of SOLANG commands. So for those of you that don't know what SOLANG is the command line that we utilize to implement rules within PIM. And essentially, that all policy is a set of the SOLANG commands. When you're defining a policy, essentially what you're looking at is you're defining a resource. You're applying controls to a resource that you want to protect, or you're looking at monitoring. When we look at monitoring, this is what we're talking about, putting things in what we would like to call a warning mode. And of course, if you don't have it in warning mode, it's in complete enforcement. Another set of SOLANG commands that we'd also like to implement, or a lot of our clients like to implement, is where we're providing delegated administrative functions, such as you want a system, you want an individual end user, or an SA or a DBA to perform some type of elevated privileges, on a particular service. One of the most important things that we have to consider with regards to policies is the fact that that PIM is an additional layer of security on top of the native operating system. So that what has to happen is both the PIM rules or the PIM policy that you deployed and the native operating system both have to say yes in order for an individual end user or a system account or anything in order to get access to that resource. That's a primary thing that needs to happen. That's the one thing that we have to remind our clients about. A lot of our clients forget that they think that, well, if I deployed a PIM policy to say that he should have access to it, the first thing we always ask is, well, did the native operating system allow them to have access to it in the first place? And if it didn't, then of course the end result would be no. Another thing that we also have to consider is PIM is a central distribution unit to deploy the policies itself. So from PIM, you actually define the policies, and then from there, you deploy the policies out to the endpoint agents. And it's the endpoint agents themselves that receive the policies and enforce the policy itself. It's not from the central server. All right, so just want to make sure that we all understand that. When we're defining PIM rules, the one thing you have to remember is you have to define the accessors, right? So these are the individuals that are going to have access to the resource. You have to define the resource, and of course, you have to define the authorization. So this user has some type of access to this resource, okay? The next thing, what are accessors, right? So accessors are users and groups, and there's a concept of, there's an internal user store within PIM that a lot of us that have dealt with the solution are aware of. And at one point in time, you have to define the user accounts into our own user store. The X user and the X group, what that allows us to do is no longer have to manage the internal user store, but we can leverage the external user store that's defined on the actual endpoint system. So, for example, if you're still utilizing the Etsy password and Etsy group files, we can leverage those. If you have your Unix box configured to talk to LDAP, we can leverage your LDAP groups or your LDAP user accounts. We don't have to manage user definitions internally within our solution any longer. We can utilize an external source. And the other thing that we can do as well, and we've seen this a lot for some backup programs, is we can define a logical account so that if this particular service, like a lot of services, like for example on a Unix box, they run as root. But maybe maybe there's this one process, like this backup program, it's going to function, it runs as root, but we want to write some PIM policies to prevent it from, to allow it to access certain files or certain directories. We could define a logical account associated with that specific backup program to access whatever resources it needs to. All right. Next, what is a PIM resource? So, common ones are files, directories, registry keys, registry values, the ability to SU to an account, the ability to log on to a server, and of course, access to outbound TCP services. Those are simple PIM resources that we could write a PIM rule for and eventually a PIM policy for to define, to deny or to allow access. When you're defining a PIM object, we have to utilize what we call an object class. So the common object classes within PIM are file, terminal, program, reg key, surrogate, and sudo. We do, for those of you that don't know, we do provide or have our own version of sudo within the solution itself. The important thing about this is that we're not leveraging the Etsy sudoers file or some other sudo files that are located on the server. The advantage here is that if you utilize our version of sudo, it's going to be centrally managed through our solution, and the solution administrators are the only individuals that have the ability to change that functionality. A lot of the problems that we see, or a lot of the problems that some of our clients have with regards to sudoers, is that usually the system administrators that utilize it also have the same capability of modifying those, and they tend to do so, and then that may show up in an audit finding. Next, authorization statements. What we're talking about is you're going to specify like what type of access do they have to that resource, whether you're going to allow read, or you're going to allow write or delete, and if you can only allow them to do that via a specific program, right? We're also talking about you're going to authorize individuals to have the ability to shut down a service, or if you're allowing them to log in to from a specific terminal. Now, one of the things that's very important to note about authorization statements is a lot of our clients often think that you could apply warning mode to an authorization statement, and that's not the case. Warning mode is something that you apply onto the actual object itself. So even though you might say that these sets of authorizations are okay, and I don't know about these other authorization steps that you've allowed, you cannot apply a warning mode to the actual individual authorization statements. You can only apply it to the actual object itself. So I think that's a very important note. Well, some of our clients often forget that, but it's something I want to make sure that you all understand. Now, there's two parts to a policy, right? There's what we would call a deployment script and an undeployment script. And very simply, a deployment script is something that is a set of PIM rules that are executed when the policy is deployed. Undeployment script is the PIM rules executed when the policy is undeployed. That's a very important concept, and we're going to talk about this when we get into some of the implementation considerations. One of the things I would like to state is that you do not have to define an undeployment script when you deploy this. I will say it's optional, and that that when you actually undeploy a policy, it will actually, if you undeploy a policy and there's no undeployment script, the PIM agent will actually undeploy the policy based off the deployment instructions. So that is something that it will do if you do not deploy one. And we'll talk a little bit more about it when we get into, like, what are the caveats with regards to that. Okay, next slide. Naming standards. Now, one of the things that I think is important, and this is something that the implementation team, that would be whether CA Services comes on site or if it's something that's done by the client by themselves, an important thing to do is to establish some type of naming conventions, especially for your policies. And the one that we in services commonly like to utilize is one based off of this, where we have what type of environment that you're looking at, what's the purpose of the application, and of course the OS platform that's associated with. And again, environment could be production, non-prod, development, staging, UAT, etc. The purposes could be, well, we might have a corporate security policy or a security audit finding that we want to address. So you would actually use that as probably your purpose. Applications, maybe a backup program, maybe this is related to Oracle, maybe this is, this policy is related to SQL Server. And of course, the OS platforms, AIX, Solaris, SUSE, HPUX, Windows. Now, one of the things that I always like to let clients know is that there is versioning control with the solution, right? And it will automatically update, like the PIM solution itself actually keeps track of version numbers of the policies themselves, but a lot of times that information is not going to be shown. So what I feel that needs to happen is if you notice here on the screen, there's a description field here, and I believe that administrators or the solution administrators that are working with this should update the description field appropriately to ensure that everyone understands what that policy is going to be doing. Or if there's a different version or something like that, make sure that you note that there in that description field. It helps out much later on when you're starting to debug or you're trying to understand what these policies are or what this policy does. At least, please update the description field. Next. And again, let me go back. Understand that it's very important you come up with a naming standard. It's something that I always feel that you need to, that everyone needs to agree with. And that it's consistent. And you make sure that all the solution administrators are aware of it and try to remove any deviations from that. Like I said, again, it helps. Now, the process of policy implementation. What do I mean by this? Essentially, what we're talking about here is like what steps you need to do when you're defining a policy. And there's some simple guidelines that I believe that we should all follow when we're defining a policy. You want to coordinate policy such that the resource is defined once. And what do I mean by that? A common problem that we see with a lot of the policies with a lot of our clients are they will define a file resource in one policy and then they define it again in another policy. What we're trying to say here is please refrain from doing that. If you define an object once in one policy, do not reference that object again in another policy. You want to make sure that these policies are standalone, that they don't interact with other policies if you can prevent that from happening. And again, it will help later on, like especially when you look at deploying like not just one, but maybe you're deploying 4 or 5 policies to a particular endpoint server. You want to make sure that those policies deployed do not interact with one another. Now, another guideline that we always like to talk about is an iterative process and to ensure accuracy. What we're talking about here is when you're deploying a policy, especially to 10, 15, or to a larger number of servers, you want to make sure that the policies that the policies that are being deployed are accurate, that they actually do what they say they will do. So you need to either, I would always, what I mean by an iterative process is you want to test. And the more testing that you do in, for example, a lab environment, the better you'll be, or a non-production environment. You want to try to do as much testing as you can to ensure that the policies are doing what they are intended to do. And another thing that you need to do, and I'm going to stress this again later on in the presentation, is you need to also compensate for any other types of processing. So if there are biannual processing or quarter annual processing, semi-annual processing, you want to make sure that that somebody goes through those processes, runs those experiments or runs those tests or executes certain procedures on that machine, because those policies that we deployed may affect their ability to actually run those actual processes. And the one thing that we always like to agree with, especially when you're doing this the first time or anything, is always use warning mode to prevent unintended consequences. You can always update the policy and you can remove the warning mode, but what you want to do is try to refrain, unless you know what you're doing, unless you feel comfortable and confident that that policy is going to be deployed and this is 100% accurate, then go ahead and take the warning mode off. But I always stress, leave it in warning mode, look at the audit logs, review the PIM audit logs, and check to see whether or not there are warning messages associated with that access for that particular policy. Okay, next. So let's talk about, in terms of the process itself. One of the things I always believe in is, the team needs to come together and establish the goal of the policy. We need to understand what that policy, what's the purpose of this policy. And that may involve not only the solution administrators, the people that are going to be defining the rules, but you need to consider the fact that you need to talk to the application owners on the server, you need to talk to, or whoever's going to be affected, whether that be the SAs, the application owners, the business owners. You should have a meeting with those individuals to understand that this policy that we're deploying is going to do this. And you need to also understand the objects, and you need to make sure that the team as a whole understands what objects we're looking at protecting. I always like to, when we as CA Services comes into a meeting when we deploy this, one of the things that we like to do is make sure that we interview those individuals and ask all the appropriate team members, any of those individuals that are affected, to make sure that, this is what we're looking at protecting. These are the set of services that we're looking at either protecting. These are the set of files, these are the directories, so on and so forth. And then make sure with them, is this the desired effect? And once we hammer that out and we're all in agreement with that, then we can start looking at, all right, let's test this out, let's deploy it. Because I don't like surprises. A lot of times, I will say in my past where we've actually deployed this, I had one client that I want to see a screen test. And when we actually did deploy the solution, it didn't happen. Nobody screamed. But after about 3 days, when we actually interviewed the system owners, the help desk, those individuals, they actually came back and said, oh, well, yeah, we found out that we heard that you guys were implementing on the server and you were applying some security controls. None of us could do what we wanted to do, so we just kind of ignored it. And I'm just stating that in order to prevent those types of situations, I always believe you need to have a meeting to come together and talk about the goals and make sure that everyone understands what's going on, and try not to do this in a vacuum, all right? Lastly, understand the users and the groups that require access to the object. And again, this goes back to making sure that you inform the SAs, the business owners, the application owners that what you intend on doing, and find out, is there anybody else that should have access to these set of resources? Now, as I said earlier, we are putting the rules in warning mode, but I always like to at least let those individuals know what we plan on doing, because I don't like surprises. The less surprises, the better. Next, the other thing that I believe that you need to do is you need to test these rules on a test server. This is key. You don't know how many times we've actually gone into client sites and they'll say, well, we just brought in this new server, we want you to deploy on this. And I'll say, no, that's not going to happen. And what we want to do is, again, it goes back to, we need to make sure that we inform the right groups, but with regards to the application, it's always important to actually test the policies against the actual servers that you intend to use it on, or the version, right? It's the best deployments are where we actually have a test environment, and I know that a lot of clients may not have like fully fledged test environments, or may not be able to afford to set up or stand up or have the support available. But I always believe that if we can get the test server as close to the actual production server as possible, the better the rules will be, or the better the policies will be when we actually deploy. I believe that is the most important thing. It makes sure that we actually define the proper objects. And then the other thing that we can do is these are where we're talking about we can run the multiple tests. Now, when we're talking about testing the rules on the actual test server, we're not deploying a policy per se. We're just testing or writing out the rules itself and recording what those rules will be. Imagine that we're writing the rules that will go into the deployment script. So we test that against the actual server, and then we can utilize those rules that we wrote and create that into deployment scripts. Right? That's essentially what I'm saying. And as mentioned earlier, you are allowed to run more tests. More tests, more success. And as I mentioned, make sure that you perform your daily, your monthly, your biweekly semi-annual processes. Whatever that is, make sure that you have the opportunity to run that. Another thing that often tends to get missed is what happens in the event of emergency. So you need to also test out whether the operations teams have some form of access to the server, and at least if we put it into enforcement mode, try to determine what needs to change. Also determine like what levels of access need to occur on that server in the event that we need to let the operations team work on a situation or work on a problem. You know, those are the types of things that, you know, the more prepared, the more testing that we do, the better and more successful the deployment will be. Next, then we can, once we're satisfied that we've actually then created the rules, we can then create a policy, and we can deploy it, and then we can look at deploying that policy again to the test server or to a set of test servers. All right. The other thing that also allows us to do is that if we intend on utilizing some of the variables that come with the solution, now we'll talk about that in a second, but there are variables that you can leverage within within PIM, and that you can also, if necessary, define your own variables as well. So let's go off on this tangent. So there are, like I just mentioned, there are variables that you can utilize in Salang. And as I've documented here in this slide, you can define what those variable values will be. So in this example, we're stating that on a Windows box, you see here, we're just saying that the JBoss home is in this directory. But on a Unix box, the JBoss home is in this specific directory. When we're deploying a policy, we can just say, independent of what platform, we say we want you to protect JBoss home, right? We're saying, you know, edit resource file, you know, the variable JBoss home, default access none, audit all. We can deploy that, and when that policy hits a Windows box, it knows, oh, JBoss home is equal to this, or JBoss home on Unix box is equal to this. I mean, I will say that that helps a lot. One of the things that I was going to say that we could also do is if, for example, you have multiple instances of Oracle, and if you have, if they're like tnsnames.orafile or on the same server, what you could do is you could define a variable on that server to locate not just that one directory, but multiple tnsnames.orafiles or multiple instances of Oracle. Hopefully, I'm not an Oracle DBA, I'm just hoping I'm using the terminology correctly. And we can just deploy one policy that says protect Oracle, and it will then, whatever that value is for the variable, it will go, all right, I will protect this. One of the other things that I was going to state that's possible with variables is you can define multiple values for that one variable. We had one client in particular, I'm not going to state the client, but they had a challenge where they wanted to protect NFS mounts, and they had offshored a lot of their access to, or I should say they had offshore administrators working on these servers, but they wanted to make sure that if they create a new NFS mount, that there was going to be a set of controls over it. So what the solutions team did was they actually set up a small shell script to run to determine what new NFS mounts were set up or stood up, and then modify the variable itself to reflect this is the new NFS mount, this is the new one, so on and so forth. So today we might be protecting one NFS mount. Tomorrow we're protecting 10. So that one variable would have 10 other associated members to that variable. And what would happen is when we would deploy the policy, protect the NFS mount, it would actually define it not only against that first one that was there, but it would do the other 9 as well, the other 10 that got created. So just letting you know, there are great possibilities within the solution. One of the things that I want to let you guys know is it's probably best if you set up the variables during the deployment cycle. So when you're looking at deploying the agents out, you probably want to look at setting up those variables on that endpoint server during that time frame. I would try to refrain from trying to set up variables through a policy solely on the basis that you're forcing that value to be something, and that value may not match to what that specific server is. So I always believe that if you set it up during the deployment cycle when you deploy the agent, it's probably far better you will be successful. All right. Oh, sorry, moving on. Let's see here. Next. Now, we're going to create the policy on the DMS. You're going to utilize, so when we create the policy we're talking about, you're going to use those rules that we set up earlier. You make sure that the objects that you're defined in the policy, make sure that they do not exist on other. So you make sure that the object that you're defining doesn't exist in another policy. Try to make sure that you have this set up and configured. And the last thing that I always believe in, and we've seen this challenge with a lot of clients, is they like to use the policy dependency. I would like to state, please refrain from using any form of policy dependency. What tends to happen is if you have it where it'll be fine if you set it up for one, but what a lot of our clients will do, and they don't know this, is sometimes they'll daisy chain dependencies on one policy to another. And what will happen is you will run into a massive problem later on where you're trying to figure out or trying to determine why one policy didn't get deployed and these other ones did, and we'll have to determine that, oh, you have policy dependencies. After a few hours or so of debugging what's going on the server, you'll find out, oh, well, policy dependency. Again, please refrain from utilizing this. You can, but I would stress try not to if you can. Was there a comment? I heard somebody was saying something. Steve, was that you? You okay?
Yeah, it looks like the slides got dropped from the screen. I'm not sure what happened. It looks like you're still connected over the phone, but not in the WebEx. Do you still see the WebEx up in front of you, Peter?
Oh, I see what's going on. I don't know what happened. I'm unable to share. Doesn't give me the option.
Yeah, it's because you got dropped from being a panelist. I'm going to try to re-add you now. It's not letting me do it for some reason, though. Peter Eiferong is in the attendee list. Sorry about this, everyone. We're going to try to get it back up in just a minute. Peter, do you want me to just load the slides up myself and you can continue that way, or do you want, I think the only other option might be to log out of WebEx and then log back in.
I can do that. Give me 1 second. I can do that really quickly. I'm going to leave the events, and let me see if I can rejoin.
Yeah, okay. Actually, I can just
Sorry about these technical difficulties, guys. My apologies. Let me see if I click on that.
Yeah.
And Okay, let me try this one last time.
Are you still on the WebEx, Peter?
I am trying to join, and I think I might have some network connectivity challenges. Oh, this is horrible. I like my ISP. All right, Kristen, I don't know. I can't even join the WebEx.
All right, I have the slides up right now, so you can continue. If you pull the presentation up on your screen, we can just continue that way, since we still have you over the phone.
What slide number are we on? Just
did you leave off on? I'm on slide 27 right now.
Slide 27. Good. Okay. No, that's a little too far.
Okay. Which one do you want me to go back to?
Let's talk. Let's see. We talked about the variables and I guess the encrypt dependencies. I am on. I guess I would be on.
Was it slide 20?
No, I'm on 22.
22. Okay. All right, we're on slide 22 now, so just let me know when you need to advance to the next slide, and I'll go to the next one.
Sure, no problem. So one of the things that I was going to state here is we're, you know, again, if you're utilizing variables, ensure that the appropriate variables are utilized, so make sure that you're not utilizing some other variables, and also ensure somehow that the values are accurate on the endpoint system. It's very important. Next slide. We should be on the assign policy to hosts, correct?
Yep.
Good. Next, so we want to make sure that when you're looking at assigning policies to the host, you want to define the appropriate targets for that policy. What you can do when you're deploying a policy, you can actually specify the individual host, or you can specify a host group. If you're deploying to a host group, make sure that you define, make sure that the endpoints to that host group are accurate. I guess that's the most important thing. But let's talk about that for a second. You know, I'll be on another tangent. So slide 24. PIM, Privileged Identity Manager, does come with its own predefined host groups. As you can see here on the slide, when the agents themselves when you actually activate the agents, one of the things they like to do is we call phone home or talk back to the infrastructure. When it does that, it actually sends back a set of information stating, I am this server, or I am, this is my host name and I'm this operating system. When it talks back to the enterprise management server, one of the things that will happen is it will, based off some of that information that's being sent back, it will say, oh, all right, you're an AIX box. I will put you automatically into this host group called AIX, or you're a 5.3 box, or you're a 6.1 box. It will put you into the appropriate host group. One of the things the reason why I've highlighted, there's these larger buckets called all Linux hosts, or all Unix hosts, or all Windows hosts. One of the things that happens is that independent of whether or not you're a Windows 2008 or 2012 box, if you're a Windows machine, it automatically goes into that host group. If you're a Linux box, independent of what version of Linux you are, SUSE, Red Hat, you know, whatever minor version, it will put you into that all Linux host group. And the same thing for all Unix hosts. Okay. Those are, again, out of the box. Next slide, 25. There is an automatic host group creation. One of the things that's important is that you can set this up, and what you can do is you can configure. There's specific sets of information like node version or these attributes that you can specify. For example, what specific, like if there's a specific type of host group that you want and you want it to automatically, like if you have your own host group set up, you can set a criteria for that, and based off that criteria associated with that one H-node entry, it will say, all right, I will join this server to this specific host group. Now, I think the important thing to note here is, and if you hit, hopefully if you hit the, if you hit the next slide or hit the page down, it will say, note, you need to modify the specific H-node entry for the specific endpoint within the DMS. So that means that in order to make this function work, you will have to modify that H-node entry for that particular server. Again, one of these attributes for that specific entry, so that it will automatically join the appropriate host group. That's something that a lot of people seem to forget about, but that is a way that will work. So you can utilize the automatic host group creation stuff, but there's still some level of manual intervention that is required in order to make it work. You'll have to go to the DMS and modify the specific H-node entry for that server. The advantage here, though, is when you're utilizing the host groups, I think a lot of people don't realize this, but if you had two different host groups and the server is a member of one, and then you joined it to the other host group, so now it's a member of two host groups, if there's a set of policies associated with the second host group, that server will now receive those policies automatically. If, let's say that you had the server now a member of host group 1 and host group 2, and you delete the association with host group 1, any policies associated with host group 1 will then become, it will actually go through the process of undeploying those policies associated with host group 1. So just letting you know that that's the advantage here. And again, if you're something where you have these automatic host group creation, utilizing this functionality within the solution, if you change that attribute, it will automatically, it will go through the process of unjoining the actual host to that specific host group and start to undeploy those policies. Now, last and certainly not least, next slide, slide 26. If you can go through the process of manually defining your own logical host groups, right? Then again, we're talking about coming up with some standard naming convention when you're defining your host groups. The process, to do this, you go to policy management, click on the host group, create host group. Under the host selection, you just select the add button, and of course you get your selection. You can select which host you want to join to that specific host group. Next slide, 27. You want to verify the policy to host. So one of the ways that you can do that is you can look at world view. Go to the world view, see what to see your environment, check the servers themselves. Another thing that you can also do is review the deployment audit logs. I tend to believe that this is probably, those two things alone will help you out the most. The two that require a lot more intervention, it will have to log into the endpoint itself and go into CLang and verify whether or not the policies are down there. You can also look at the local audit logs on the endpoint, or go into the policy fetcher log and see whether the policy got submitted that way or entered through that mechanism. Okay, next slide, 28. Let's talk about policies. Now, a lot of our clients often ask us, like, what's the best, when the implementation comes in, I should say the CA implementation team comes in, a lot of times they'll ask us is, what type of policies, what do we want to build? And we often tell them, well, what do you want to build? When we come to that moment, or if I even see that moment arising, the first thing I tell them is, well, let's take a look at your last audit logs, or there's a set of audit findings, or there's an audit report. Can we look at that? And based off of that report, we can then look at addressing these specific problems with we realize this is the type of policies that we need to build to address these concerns. Another thing that we can look at, some of our clients they'll have set up, or they'll have a security policy that they would like to have implemented. Sometimes some of our clients will it's loosely implemented or whatever. They'll tell us that, and what we'll say is, well, let's take a look at your security policies and see if we can map your security policies to things that the PIM solution can do. Last and certainly not least, I like to do, you know, we would conduct a set of interviews with possibly IT audit or IT compliance, IT security operations. These are the most, you know, these individuals will have a good understanding of what type of security controls that they feel we need to apply within the environment. The other thing that we could also do is we can talk to the enterprise architecture, because they would have a better idea, possibly often, to know what type of policies that we want to deploy. And last and certainly not least, we may want to interview management to determine whether or not they're aware of other types of security challenges that they would like our solution to do. Moving to the next slide, slide 30. You know, what we will do is once we get that set of information, the most important thing that we need to do is we need to translate those ideas or what they would like to do into things that PIM can do, and which would mean that we would have to translate that into a class that PIM manages. So, for example, if we want to prevent unauthorized access to specific files or directories, or even monitor access to specific files and directories, often that would be the file class object. If we're trying to prevent unauthorized access to some shared account via SU or sudo, that would be the surrogate class object. All right, and if we're looking at preventing some form of unauthorized login, terminal, you know, terminal class is a great class to utilize. Next slide, 31. Other things that we could do, for example, well, this is one that's come up, you know, a while back, is I want to disable the use of USB drives on Windows. Well, those are usually associated with a reg key and a reg val object class, and we can identify what those classes are, and we can protect against those things. We can define file resources. We can define reg key and reg value entries and make sure that that registry key value doesn't change to enable the USB drive. I want to prevent unauthorized access to applications. Well, that's usually going to be a file in a program class object that we would write, and we would have to identify what the actual application is, the directory, the actual executable itself. Prevent unauthorized shutting down of processes. Well, you know, there is the process class, and then that might also involve maybe the file and program classes as well. All right. Next slide. 32. If we're looking for a list of what PIM objects are there, I will say that you could probably go to the wiki pages for CA, and this would be the wiki pages, you know, right here. You would have to log in. If you're looking for specifically, I would look at the reference guide, and you're looking at the Salang reference guide. If you hit page down, there's going to be a section called classes in the AC environments, and this is where you start seeing your PIM objects. You'll see like there's an agent type, Apple, auth host, calendar, category. As you scroll down, there's I forgot how many different objects there are. I wanted to say there was something to the effect of 47. I could be wrong, but I know that there's a lot of classes within PIM and that manage different types of access or different types of objects on the server itself. Next slide. So one of the things I was going to state is in the event that our clients don't either have that or we're not able to get that, one of the things that we can share with them is we do have some sample policies with the solution itself. And if you look onto the server where the enterprise management server is deployed, under the control minder, under the PIM directory, you'll see the PIM home directory. There'll be a samples directory, and there's the subdirectory called policies. In there, you'll see applications, OS, out of the box virtualization, and you select. And when you go into there, you will see which one specifically that you're looking for. Slide 34. Caveats of sample policies. One of the things that I want to say about the sample policies, page down, is we recommend that, CA recommends that you customize the policy to your specifications. These policies actually have a lot of sections in there that there may be variables that you need to set or variables you need to change. So I would not take these policies verbatim. You need to look at these policies and make the appropriate modifications as necessary. All right. The other thing, page down again, CA recommends thorough testing for each policy in the target environment before you deploy it. So again, it goes back to the whole testing part, getting a test server, But if you're looking at deploying any of these policies, make sure that you bring this in to that one meeting where you're getting all the people involved together and go through the policy itself and walk them through that. Help them understand, because a lot of these individuals won't know Salang text. They won't understand what that means. But what we want to do is at least point out the different objects that we're looking at protecting and let them know, all right, this is the object itself that we're looking at protecting. We also want to authorize this group of users to have access to it. Do you think that's right? Do you think that's appropriate? Do we need more? Do we need less? You want to have, again, those conversations with that. And then, again, test it out in a test box. Very important. Now, policy deployment considerations. Again, this is what we're talking about, our best practices. Next slide, 36. One of the things that helps out is utilize a text editor. One of the common ones that we in CA Services like to utilize is Notepad++ when we're looking at creating the deployment and undeployment scripts. The reason why we want to utilize Notepad++ and not Notepad is because what we've seen in the past is, especially if you're doing a lot of cutting and pasting from other sources, or if you're looking at cutting and pasting from another server or something to that effect, what tends to happen is the fonts, I think Notepad has retained some of the font information or understands like there's different fonts that are being utilized, and what will happen is when you deploy the policy, it may error out. Notepad++, the one advantage there is that it tends to be font agnostic, so it doesn't care, or I like to say it's font agnostic, that might not be the right terminology, but it doesn't care about confusing the backwards tick as a single tick or something to that effect. That often doesn't happen. And we want to make sure that, you know, less errors in the syntax, the better the policy will be deployed, the more successful the policy will be deployed. So again, utilizing, you know, a text editor such as Notepad++ helps out in that process a lot. The other thing I always believe in, include comment statements. You know, basic programming stuff, but a lot of people forget to do that. Unless you're comfortable and confident with what you know the policy is, go ahead. But often at times, what tends to happen a lot is, you know, you might be working on this project, you might be working on a specific project or a specific application team for 2 or 3 months, and then you've deployed that policy and it's working successfully, and then you, all right, move on to the next one. 6 months later or a year later, somebody needs, well, we need to change these policies. You need to go back and look at those, you know, that policy and figure out what does that do. And often, if you have a comment there, it'll help you out. Another thing that I always feel is very, very important, and I know that some of our some customers I know don't do this, but whenever I deal with the clients, I always tell them, please do this: is create a policy directory on the ENCM server or wherever you're logging in to create your policies, whether that be on your desktop or your workstation. Make sure that you have some type of a directory where you actually store the policy deployment and the policy undeployment scripts. I would stress working off that model, right? If you're logging on to the ENCM server, if you're allowing your system administrators to log, or I should say your solution administrators to log on directly to the ENCM server, store the policy deployment scripts there, and then have them work off that server if they can. So, you know, if that means it's deployed on Windows, RDP to that server. It helps, and I stress the word it helps a lot. That way you get into practice of, and the other thing that also is there is that you have the deployment and undeployment scripts. You can easily copy and paste and make the necessary modifications to it there, as opposed to copying and pasting it from the window or some other source. It's better that you have it on the actual server. All right. One of the things that I wanted to point out here, though, is it does mean that you're allowing your solution administrators to log on to the enterprise management server. I noticed that for some of our DoD accounts or some government accounts, because of separation duties, that may not be possible. But again, like I said earlier, if you need to, go ahead and have your solution administrators create a PIM folder or PIM policy folder on their workstation and store the deployment and undeployment scripts there. Next slide. 37. What you can do is when you're creating your policies, you load them into the ENCM UI when you're constructing the policy. So when you're getting to this point where you're doing your policy script, page down, you should click on the Browse button. right there, then what will happen is that another window will show up page down where you actually decide, you know, I'm looking at my PIM folders, my PIM policy folder here, and then I can decide whether I want the deployment script or the undeployment script. I make sure that I select it, page down, and highlight, you know, click on the open button, and go page down again. You'll see that it populates the load deployment script area, right? And then page down, click on the load button, page down, you'll notice that that area there that I've highlighted will get populated with the deployment script, right? Very important, always a good thing to do. And the same process is going to be involved when you do the undeployment script. You know, you click your browse, find the undeployment script, open, load it, and then when both windows are full of the set of data that you need, you know, click OK or select, and then you know, submit. Slide 38. One of the important things that we need to determine, and a lot of customers don't think about this, and I think I mentioned this earlier, was the undeployment scripts, right? Determine the desired effect for the undeployment script. What do I mean by that? If you do not, if you don't define an undeployment script, well, the PIM agent is going to go through and undeploy the policy for you. So whatever objects that you created, whatever authorization statements you defined, it will go through and remove those, right? But understand what that means. That means that if you were protecting or if you were monitoring any resources, and if you had authorizations for that, they're gone. They're eliminated. That means that, for lack of a better term, those resources that you were protecting and monitoring, you're no longer monitoring or protecting that. If that's your desired effect, then fine. But some clients, on the other hand, will say, no, we don't want that to happen. So what we can do is, you know, go ahead and modify or create an undeployment script for the desired effect. And one of the things that we always believe is go ahead and recreate those policies or recreate those objects, but put them in a warning mode so that you can at least audit what's happening to those files or to those resources when we undeploy the script. Now that's, again, that's all subjective. That's all based on what you want to do. But I always believe that, you know, some clients, they will tell, we're fine with undeploying it altogether and not protecting anything. Other clients are saying, no, I want to at least provide some minimal layer of monitoring and protection. So again, make sure that if you define what you want for your undeployment scripts. All right. Next slide, 39. Another thing that you need to be, you need to know is you want to be concise. You want to limit the size of deployment and undeployment scripts in terms of the number of lines. You know, we've had in the past where clients are looking at deploying like 800 rules in their policies. I would strongly suggest not doing that and try to minimize it. You know, the ideal situation would be, you know, no more than 200. These are my suggested limits. But I would say that, you know, this tends to be a very good practice to do. But try not to deploy anything more than like 800 lines. It becomes tedious, and I think it becomes long in terms of deployment cycles or anything. Again, being concise, keeping it small is probably the best bet. Of course, you know, also, you know, you're managing the comment statements as well. Next slide, 40. So the use of variables, you know, as I mentioned earlier, you want to define the variables. The best time to do it is defining it during the agent deployment, right? You have some process in there. If you make the deployment agents, or if you make, part of the things you could do is you could make deployment smart enough so that define the agent and make sure that it looks for the appropriate directory. Or where, you know, if you're looking at, you know, the home directory for JBoss, for example, or SQL Server, or Oracle, where the TNS names that Oracle files are at. Make sure that you define that variable probably during the deployment cycle. Easier to do it then than later on, right? Another thing that we've seen in the past is refrain from utilizing too many variables within a deployment and undeployment script. Again, try to you know, be concise with your rules and try not to reference as many variables unless you need to. I would try it again. Don't try to hit like don't try to deploy one policy to hit as many problems as possible. I would say if you're looking at addressing a security problem, make sure that, you know, or a security audit finding, make sure that it's dealing with those specific files and not having to deal with SQL or Oracle, make sure that you deploy a separate policy for that. All right. Next slide, 41, policy dependencies. As I mentioned earlier, you want to minimize its usage and refrain from stacking policy dependencies. Like I saw one instance where one client ran into, again, I mentioned earlier, one client didn't understand why they had challenges with deploying this one policy when they had like 5 or 6 other dependencies configured. Then they were all dependent upon each other. So when one failed, it all failed. So that's why I would state, try to minimize as much as possible any form of dependency as you can. It's there in the solution. It does work, but I stress refrain from stacking. Next slide, 42. Limit resource definitions, right? Refrain from defining, as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that if you define one object within one policy, don't define it again in another policy. What will tend to happen is a policy will complain, or the policy deviation calculator will complain that this policy has been modified. If you hit page down, you'll see, I'm going to show you an example on, let's say, on slide 43. Notice what I have here is I have production Oracle Unix, AIX, and production security AIX, sample policies. Now, page down, notice that even though I've defined, C:\foo, the default access in one policy is read, the other one is none, right? Because that's what we wanted, or apparently, we're not, or apparently that's what the client wanted, or something to that effect. Again, this is just an example. What will happen is, when the policy deviation calculator run, it's going to complain saying that one of the policies is this one, the Oracle AIX policy is incorrect or it's deviated because it now has default access of none, as opposed to the proper default access of read. Other thing that you'll notice is, page down, that the authorization statements, there's 2 different sets of authorization statements. One is for IFUPE01, that has access none, and authorization statement for ZERF01 is all. On the endpoint, you may get on the endpoint, what will end up happening is it'll define the C:\foo, but whatever policy was the last one to get implemented, it'll state the default access is going to be set to. Let's say that we deployed the security one last, the default access for C:\foo will be set to none. In addition, it'll have 2 additional authorization statements that should not be there, or maybe it should be there. But what I'm getting to the point here, guys, and gals, is if you're going to write this one file rule to protect this one object, make sure it's in the same policy. Don't try to set it up in 2 different policies. Don't do that. That's just a big no-no. Don't do that. Next slide, 44. One of the things that I also believe in is when you're naming your policies, refrain from any form of special characters, $signs, £signs, backslash, single ticks, backward ticks, double quotes, types, exclamation marks. Refrain from doing that and just change the case, change uppercase, lowercase, and use underscores. Those are acceptable. Try, again, not to utilize any of the special characters. Next slide. Q&A. Do we have any questions or comments? I know that we're at the top of the hour. I just want to know if there's any questions or comments from the field or from anybody on the phone. Or Steve, have you been answering any questions?
I got a question from Jayahar. I worked on CA Access Control earlier. Is this the same product with a different name and enhancements, or are there 2 different products altogether?
I will say that they are the same products. The question I want to ask Jayahar would be, what version of the solution is he running? Now, if he's running version 8, if he's familiar with version 8 of the solution or previous from R12, so I will say that the interfaces that we're showing are completely different than what he's familiar with the R8 and R5 and 4 versions, anything prior to R12.
He said he worked on versions until R12.5.
Got it. then I will say that the UIs are going to be slightly different, and the distribution model is completely different. What we have now when we're deploying the solutions is, if you're familiar with what we call the PMDBs, policy model databases, that was the means of distributing rules at one point in time to a set of hosts or to the recipients of that policy model database. This newer model utilizes what we call APM, or Advanced Policy Management. What we do here is we define a policy, and we can specify we can specify where that policy goes by the host group. So the easiest way to look at this is, the way I look at it is the PMDBs, for lack of a better term, were dumb. They only deployed policies based on what their set of subscribers were. With APM, you can actually get a little bit more granular. You don't have to worry about standing up additional PMDBs to just make sure that you hit a specific set of hosts. You can actually, based on the logical grouping, if you want, or if you utilize the out-of-the-box host groups, you can make sure that policy goes to where it needs to go. Also, Jehar, the one thing I was going to state is policies are a collection of access control or auto secure or control minder or rules. That's what it is. It is essentially think of it as a logical container. And one of the advantages that we have with it is we can perform what we call deviation calculations to determine whether or not those policies have changed from the moment of deployment. One of the things we had in the past where with the old model is if I set a rule in the PMDB and it got distributed down to an endpoint, somebody on the endpoint, another solution administrator can log in and change the policy on the endpoint, and nobody knew that rule changed. Nobody would know unless you looked at the audit logs or you actually physically looked on. The advantages with the R12 technologies, in the R12, especially now with R12.8, is if the policy or the rule changed on the endpoint, a solution administrator went in and made that change, we do have a facility to at least document that rule or that policy changed on that specific endpoint, and we can set up some form of notification to basically state that you need to go look at this, some administrator changed that rule. So hopefully that explains a little bit more. Maybe that's a little more long-winded, but thanks, Kristen. Any other questions? Hopefully I answered Jehar's end.
Yeah, he just followed up and said that helps, thank you. And then he asked, why is this named Privileged Identity Manager? What are we doing specific to privileged users here?
One of the things I wish I could join rejoin the WebEx. One of the things, because I could actually demonstrate that, is we do have what comes with our solution now is we have what we call like shared account management. That's included. But as far as like privileged identities, the way I see it is, and Steve, you have an excellent answer for that. I'm kind of out. Steve, are you still on? Are you on mute? We have product management, Mike Galea, on the line to determine.
Sorry, maybe I had failed to push the correct buttons. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. I believe privileged identity management is a market discipline that controls a number of areas. One is controlling access to shared accounts, high privilege accounts like root and administrator and SA, by hiding the password and providing a controlled way of getting to those accounts. The fine-grained controls that formerly were access control are components of our privileged identity management solution and pick up where controlling access to the high privilege account leaves off. So shared account management controls access to the root account, for example, by hiding the password, but it doesn't control what you can do with the root account once you have it on a server. The fine-grained access controls through privileged identity management pick up there and make enforcement for those high privileged accounts. Generally, you wouldn't use policies that aren't effective to root anyway. So these are controlling what the high privileged accounts can do after the user has acquired access to the account by taking custody of the password.
Okay, and we got one more question in here from Somya. How does this work with Arcot Authminder integrations? Are there any set requirements?
Yeah, I'll take that one real quick if you don't mind. There are two ways of integrating with our advanced authentication or Authminder or Arcot. The one is that strong authentication can be used on the enterprise management front end. So the administrators of the product, as well as potentially users who are checking out passwords, could be subject to a two-factor authentication, and that's implementing that is documented. There's a second capability that's provided as an integration with advanced authentication, and that is on Unix Linux endpoints, where you have to authenticate as a named user in order to use the root account. That would apply to any root user who is logged in directly, will be essentially a restricted user, have very little capability even though they're logged in as root, until such time as you authenticate as a named user. So this is an optional capability you can use to require second factor authentication on a Unix or Linux endpoint when the user is root. And that can work the opposite way as well, so that a named user logs in and wants to acquire the root account, you can require them to provide strong authentication prior to granting that root access. So the two options again, strong authentication to the enterprise console, which is the user interface that users use as well, and this restricted user on root for Unix and Linux systems. And both of those are documented in the manuals.
Okay, great. Somya said thank you. And then another follow-up question from Jehar. He said, yes, I have worked with other vendors' PIM solutions, but I'm trying to understand what module has been added to the older CA Access Control product to introduce this feature.
So Access Control is now part of a larger product called CA Privileged Identity Manager that includes an independent module called Shared Account Management. It provides a password-safe and encrypted storage of passwords for any type of endpoint, like a server, database, application, what have you, and a service by which authorized users can check out the passwords or check them back in. So this is a measure that controls access to the passwords for shared accounts. That's something that was not present in the old Access Control product. The other component that is in Privileged Identity Manager that wasn't in the old Access Control product is a Unix authentication bridge that allows you to authenticate to Unix Linux endpoints is using your domain credentials, Active Directory credentials, in a Kerberized way. So you can take advantage of single sign-on and the security that Kerberos provides. And it solves the identity problem, so you don't have to manage users on the Unix endpoints. Instead, you can configure all their Unix security in Active Directory and use domain credentials to log in. So the Shared Account Management module and the Unix Authentication Bridge are two capabilities that are modules that are components of Privileged Identity Management today. And the old Access Control product, the latest version of it, is also a component of PIM, which now constitutes all three of those modules.
Okay, great. He said, got it, wonderful features, thank you for the clarification. So I don't see any other questions in here, just lots of positive feedback coming in from everyone thanking us for this informative and helpful webcast. So thank you to Peter for presenting and Steve for assisting in answering some of these questions. I have a slide up here. We're going to be posting the slides and the recording of this webcast to the CA Security community. If you're not already a community member, you can go and join at communities.ca.com. And the security community is located at ca.com/talksecurity. That's our short URL that we created for it. The community is a great place to learn about best practices and use cases like the topic we discussed today. You can connect with product management and support as well as other customers and share your experience and expertise with other customers and partners that are using CA Security products. Other products covered in that community are Single Sign-On, Identity Suite, Secure Cloud, Data Protection, the Advanced Authentication products, and CA Directory. And like I said, my name is Krista Malzone. I'm the Community Manager for the security community. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions there. And thanks again for joining today, everyone, and thank you again, Peter.
No worries. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, end the meeting now. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.